All right, we're live, and now I'm going to admit everybody. 36 people. Good afternoon, everyone. I'll go ahead and welcome you here, and we'll get started. I appreciate everyone taking the time to join us today. As you know, we have a guest speaker today, Matt Gould. I'll go ahead and introduce him and let him get started. So with that, if you don't know Matthew Gould is a well-known and well-connected analyst and consultant in the dairy industry. He is the author of the Dairy Market Analyst, which is a widely followed industry newsletter, and is on a personal standpoint is one of my go-to sources on a weekly basis for dairy market information, and appreciate Matt for making that available to us all. But he's also a chief market analyst at Rice Dairy LLC, a dairy futures brokerage. His insights on industry subjects are regularly requested, including recent citations in Bloomberg, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. Matt also writes for Progressive Dairy and has earned a BS in economics from the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School, and grew up on a dairy farm in Western New York that is in its third generation of ownership. And just a couple of housekeeping items before I turn it over to Matt. We will be using the chat feature for questions. So if you have any questions at any time, go ahead and enter those into the chat box there at the bottom of your screen. And there, Matt said there's sort of a natural break in the middle of his program. If there's any questions between now and then, we'll just hold those and answer those when he's halfway through. And then at the end of his presentation, we'll go ahead and open that up for more questions and answers as well. And again, just use that chat box. If there's something that it goes on, it'd be better to go ahead and ask that question while Matt's on that topic. We'll answer it then, so we don't lose track of that question. And with that, Matt, if you want to go ahead and take over, please do. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Zach, and thanks for the introduction. Before I get into the presentation, I did want to share a little bit more about my personal background. I grew up and worked on a dairy farm in Western New York. Actually, I just left. I was a Keystone Stater for about a decade, and I just moved back closer to where I grew up to start a family. So I am back in New York. But I was at a producer meeting last week, and one of the things that I guess I tried to start off with there, and I'm going to try to start off with here, is one, talking a little bit about my connection to the dairy farm, and two, my admiration for all of your work. I don't think that many of you work 24/7 pretty well, or on call 365, and you don't get to hear the thanks that I think you deserve. So in my case, I grew up and worked on a dairy farm, and I worked next to my grandfather, who founded the farm in 1950 and in the 1950s, and I worked next to my father, who would be the second generation and is involved in his co-op. And I worked next to my brother, my youngest brother, who is now the third generation. And I worked next to my oldest brother, who is a dairy food scientist. And I now have a sister-in-law who's working to try and develop a market for premium dairy beef to support farmers in this area of Western New York. And my wife is involved in our dairy business. So, I think all of you know that you play a role in feeding the world. I don't know that there's a full appreciation for the reverberations for generations that your work has. So I want to start out and say thank you for what you do, and recognize that. In today's presentation, I've kind of broken it up into two parts. If you've seen, I've done an outlook like this once before, where I try and look at just the high level, keep it simple, macro patterns. And so we're going to start off going with that. And then in the second half of the presentation, we're going to zoom in and we're going to talk about all the craziness that is going on, whether that's the government intervention, the unwinding of the pandemic, and then a conversation about milk supplies. So that's kind of the layout for today. Is first we're going to talk about these big picture things, and then we're going to zoom in on these lower level items. So first, the zoom out part of the presentation. I want to talk about 4 cycles. You're familiar with some of them. For some of you, you'll have never seen this before. First is milk supply cycle globally. That one, milk production growing is price negative. Milk production contracting is obviously price positive. We're going to update on that. The inventory cycle, the trade cycle, and the one that every dairy farmer is familiar with, which is, of course, the 3-year cycle, where every 3 years you have high prices and every 3 years you have low prices, and then somewhere every that middle year is in between. So I want to start with the first question here from the high level. If this is the keep it simple, stupid approach to dairy markets, if you will, KISS. Where are we in the global milk supply cycle? And so this is milk production growth on a milk equivalent basis added up around the world. And what you see is, I kind of want to identify a couple of thresholds. Whenever you get above 2 billion pounds of milk growth per day, milk growth per month globally, you're in a very overheated part of the cycle. You can see the heavy growth rates after 2014 that led to those low prices thereafter. The other kind of threshold is this 1 billion pounds of milk per month in terms of new milk production. If you're growing milk at less than that rate, well, that tends to be price supportive. And that reason why that billion-pound threshold is important is that's over the long term, somewhere close to where we've grown global dairy demand. You can see at the moment that we're kind of in this neutral territory. We're exceeding this 1 billion pounds per month. We aren't in the super oversupplied territory, but as we look on into 2021, certainly if we get milk production growth out of Europe, we could begin testing it. But at this very moment, where are we at? We're kind of in a neutral situation. So the first out of the 4 we're looking at, not talking about anything extreme. Second high level item is what I call the inventory cycle. And what I've done on this chart is I've taken all the global public data for dairy stocks and I've converted it into non-fat solids. So non-fat solids is the lactose, the protein, and the ash in the milk. Whenever we have big inventories of dairy products, whether that's cheese, butter, or milk powder, that tends to overhang markets. Obviously, we just experienced that with this massive European intervention stocks that basically held down milk prices 2015 and after. But if you look back historically, whenever we pull down inventories, that's when we tend to have price inflationary times. 2014, I think everyone will remember. You can think about 2007, same thing. So, where are we at in terms of that, inventory cycle? Well, we don't have those massive inventories. I wouldn't exactly call it super low. If I'm going to sum it up, I'd say, yeah, I think we can comfortably say we're in the price inflationary part of this inventory cycle. So the first one, milk supply, we're talking neutral. The second indicator, we're saying, okay, well, we're price inflationary. Okay, now next one I want to talk about quickly is the trade cycle. Now the trade cycle makes sense in that when we go and we negotiate trade agreements, we lower the cost for consumers worldwide, or at least in those markets that we have trade agreements. And as a consequence of that, well, they buy more. We haven't had new trade agreements in the US for some period of time. And of no surprise, we aren't having particularly robust growth in in total international demand. And you can see that period from 2008 to 2014, where we had all these new trade agreements preceding it, and you had this above average increase in global trade. Fast forward to today, and we're kind of growing global demand at a typical rate. And you can also see on this chart, well, global trade really stunk during the middle of the pandemic. So where are we in the trade cycle? It's neutral. And then the last kind of big cycle thing that I think we're all familiar with is the 3-year cycle, where every 3 years there's high prices and every 3 years there's low prices. I mean, you can count from 2009, 2012, 2015, 2018, 2021. So if you just look at the 3-year cycle, 2021 is shaping, is on track to be a bad year. If you did the opposite, again, this is the keep it simple, stupid approach to dairy markets, and you go from 2014, 2017, granted that wasn't a big pop, 2020, it did successfully predict those high class 3 milk prices. Something that's worth noting though, and this is what we're going to talk about in the second half, is that if you look at the class 4 prices, well, 2020 didn't seem to match the cycle. And that divergence between these very high class 3 prices and these class 4 prices have a lot to do with the pandemic, milk being pushed back on the milk powder plants, and government intervention, which favored cheese markets. But so that's where I want to start off today is just this summary of where we're at. And the bottom line is it's a mixed bag. 2020 is not setting up to be a year of extreme prices. Or sorry, 2021 is not setting up to be a year of extreme prices. 2020 was. Now, I don't think that this did fully explain, well, what happens when you have a pandemic and you have cheese prices going to $1, and then what happens when you have a pandemic and the coronavirus responses, which takes cheese to $3. No, it didn't explain that. But it does, these high level items do give us a pretty good feel about what is a reasonable thing to expect. And when you put it all together, I put it on a scorecard. It's a mixed bag scorecard. You actually have to go back probably 2017 to see a similar type year, if you will, in terms of these cycles on unloading. We followed a year where the scorecard definitely tilted positive. And this year, not so much. So, I wish I was starting off with from the high level, everything is green, 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 green. Go grab your moon boots because we're about to rock it off. But that's just not the situation going into 21. It's a mixed bag, and the keep it simple, stupid, the KISS approach, puts us kind of in called a middle road year. Now, I also want to point out that at the moment, everything seems very, at least in the industry, feels very price negative. We have these big growth rates in milk production. We have processing plants that are being pushed to capacity. In many parts of the country, we have milk at huge discounts under class and over-based programs with big deductions. And right now it feels like we're in 2018 where it's red, red, red. But if you can zoom out, it's actually kind of more of a mixed bag year. So, I know that's not total consolation, but I hope it's at least partial consolation. Now, this is kind of where the natural stop point is, because this is all the high level stuff. I'm about to drop in and do talk about some of these more current event type situations. We're going to go from the KISS approach, which is just kind of these simple patterns, to a conversation about the government, about rolling out of the pandemic, about these higher feed costs. So at this very second, Zach, are there any questions in the chat box that people have before we kind of zoom in?
No, there's nothing in the chat box. I did think of one thing while you were talking about the 3-year cycle. I know earlier in my career in the dairy industry, it was sort of a 5-year cycle, and that shortened to a 3-year cycle. Do you see at some point that 3-year cycle getting shorter than what it is now, or do you think that 3-year cycle is gonna remain in place for the foreseeable future?
I have a few theories on the 3-year cycle, which they're not the popular theories. So the 3-year cycle, from my perspective, has a lot to do with investment. And it has a lot to do with investment on farm, which is how you get these, cyclical, let's see if we can go back, increases in milk production, where you get these boom and these busts resulting from milk prices. So it's one part on farm investment. And then it's also one part processing plant investment. So as we went into 2021, we had very few new cheese plants, for example, coming online. And as a consequence of that, I think it seemed very likely that we had the potential to spike. Now, could we have spiked as high as we did without the government? Like, absolutely not. But certainly our situation was such that we were limited on processing capacity. Heading into 2021, we have some massive investment in processing capacity. I think the most well-known is that new plant in St. John's, Michigan, which is the largest cheese plant startup ever in the history, possibly in the history of the world, I believe in the history of the US. And at capacity, which I think it'll hit here in April or May, which is ahead of schedule, that plant will be something like the 6th largest American type cheese plant in the US. So the way that these cheese plants work is that when you start them up, you don't start them up and then over the course of 10 years add to them. You start them up and you go from 0 to, over the course of 6 months, 8 million pounds of processing per day. And I think that's at least one of the reasons, these new cheese plants and their step change and increase, which affects that 3-year cycle. The other side of that is you take, this is 2020 is a good year where we had many producers had decent milk checks, especially after the government supplementation. And what does that translate into? Is it translates into not a lot of milk in, say, October, but a lot of milk as we get into a 6 and 9 month delay, and that's kind of where we're at now. So as far as I can tell, I think the underpinnings of the cycle are still in place. At least as far as I can tell. Okay, so now I'm gonna zoom in a little bit and talk about some of these big ideas of the day. We have government intervention, we have the vaccine distribution and the unwinding of the pandemic and what that's going to do to dairy demand. And then I'd like to talk about milk supply, and then wrap up with what what's going on in terms of where I think product prices are going to go. And one of the things that has been in some cases a huge help, and in other cases just a terrific frustration this past year, has been government intervention. I added it up, and through all the different programs last year, the US government spent a total of about $4.9 billion on dairy. If you put that across 100 weight, for all of the milk that was produced in 2020, the US government spent about $2.20. So we're going through a period of massive government spending. And I've had a lot of people ask me about, well, what does the Democrats mean for dairy as opposed to the Republicans? And I don't really think that's the right framework to think about government intervention through. At the moment, I think the right framework is pandemics happen about once in a century, and pandemic policies happen at about the same rate. So 2020 isn't setting up to have another $4.9 billion in dairy support. That's got to be an all-time record high. And so we are going to have less government intervention this year, but the question isn't about that so much. It's about when we're going to have less government intervention. Coming into November, Congress was deadlocked, and the expectation among the industry was that the Farmers to Family Food Box program, for example, was going to end at the end of December. All of a sudden in December, Congress decided to work together, and we got the stimulus bill. And overnight, there was just shy of $1 billion of dairy product purchases through that program. And in addition to just a whole bunch of wild cards about what can happen in terms of government intervention. And so instead of kind of reviewing the play-by-play of what happened last year, I want to start out talking about what we can expect this year. And so I have the short-term timeline that I've presented here. In the stimulus bill, there was $1.5 billion and this is how the bill wrote it. They said that USDA has to spend no less than $1.5 billion on food purchases, including dairy, meat, fish, and produce. USDA then took that and said, okay, we're going to announce the extension of the Farmers to Family Food Box Program, $1.5 billion. It's going to end in April. Well, then last week, they surprised everyone when they didn't announce $1.5 billion of purchases, but they only announced $354 million in purchases. And if you continue at that spending level, they didn't say it, but it was through the end of February. If you continue at that spending level, it only adds up to $1.1 billion of purchases. And so there's this $400 million that is currently just a big unknown. And that's how this first half of the year is. We have the pandemic still going through the countryside, and we have the government just injecting a tremendous amount of uncertainty into the market. I had someone say this, and a contact of mine said this, and I wholeheartedly agree. For the first half of 2021, dairy markets are the murkiest that they've ever been. And they're very dependent on USDA's choice of how they want to whipsaw or not whipsaw our marketplace. So that's just the situation. Fundamentals are particularly weak, and I'll get into that in a second. But then this government purchasing, where the government is in February is currently buying somewhere around 2% of the U.S. milk supply, and in March and April could buy more than 3%, has enough to throw dairy markets around. So we don't know a lot. We have a lot of known unknowns, as Donald Rumsfeld would say. So the next announcement with regards to the Farmers to Family Food Box Program is probably going to happen in the middle of February. I thought it was all going to happen in January. They surprised us last week with their rather opaque announcement. Okay, and then there's a dairy donation program. Now, we've never seen this before. The dairy donation program is a brand new program, and it's stocked with $400 million. Depending on how USDA treats that program, they could buy virtually all the butter in inventory with $400 million, or they could, depending on the program, they could render it useless. So, we have a question mark on the Farmers to Family Food Box Program. We have a question mark on this dairy donation program, and then payments to producers. Another question mark. In the stimulus bill, the bill told USDA to have top-up payments for any of those producers that were capped out of the CFAP programs. It also gave USDA discretion that if they wanted to make further payments to producers, they could. And so, although we've had the stimulus bill, although we're approximately a month into this new stimulus bill, there's a whole bunch of known unknowns. How much is the government going to buy, and for how long? Will they make payments to producers? If so, how much and when? And at this point, they're known unknowns. It's as I said, it's a murky marketplace. And okay, so that's what's happening on the government side at the moment. Out in the countryside, we just had a milk production report that showed milk production of 3.1%. Total demand for cheese and butter, at least according to my estimates, is still contracting. And so we have a weak pandemic dairy demand environment and a government that is being particularly unclear with its intentions. And so that leaves this first half of the year in a particularly precarious position. And I know, what kind of outlook is that? And this is the reality of when you have a major influence in the market, the government, and they have the money and the cannons to do something, but we don't know if they have the will or exactly where their mind is at. So in terms of risk, what does that mean for the first half of the year? Well, I'm going to go through on the next two slides, two different scenarios for the Farmers to Family Food Box program. But the bottom line is that the chance of extremely low prices and the chance of extremely high prices are quite high. And that's an unusual market environment to be in. Usually things are either bearish or bullish. And in this situation, with the government involved, all you can really say in terms of anything concretely is that it's volatile. So here I've modeled out the yellow is the block cheese price, and the black is the government spending on this food box program. They underspent in February. As I said, if you extrapolate how they're spending through February, it's $1.1 billion in spending. If instead they use what they didn't spend in February and use it to buy products in March and April, well, it's very possible that we see $2.50 cheese and $20 milk prices. On the flip side, if they don't do that, which we don't know and they haven't particularly provided guidance on, it's very possible that they just buy the current rate, that we're talking 170-ish cheese and possibly lower. So the first half of the year, that's where we're at. We're very dependent on this, on the choices of USDA and how they want to influence it. So from a risk perspective, is that there's just a lot of it. And if you look at options prices, for example, they're extremely high. If you look at DRP insurance prices, you'll find the same thing. They're extremely high because of all of this uncertainty in the marketplace about what the government is going to do. Okay, that's the government piece. They're whipsawing all over the place. This chart just shows this year how much they've whipsawed all over the place. And I've modeled here if they step up purchases. Now I want to talk about the unwinding of the pandemic. Vaccines are being distributed. When I added it up last, I think I estimated something close to 15% of the country either had the first vaccine or knew that they had coronavirus. So call it 15% of the country has some level of immunity to coronavirus. As we look forward and we think about May or June or July, I think that's when we see immunity as a nation start to hit close to that 40-50% threshold. And that's when we really start seeing the reversal in behaviors that occurred in the pandemic. I think we all remember early in the pandemic when restaurants shut down, milk was dumped all over the country. We had this massive contraction in demand. The second half, the unwinding, is the opposite of that. We have all this pent-up demand. For example, people don't want to go to restaurants. They haven't been going to restaurants. As we unwind and reverse, we'll have strength in restaurant demand. As kids go back to school, we'll have strength in school demand. Obviously, that's not really going to happen significantly until we get to August and September of next year. So, if you think about it from a high level, we have the first half of the year in a very precarious situation, and the second half of the year in a much more balanced outlook. So here's my estimates of dairy demand in the pandemic. And this is from June to November. I threw out May and April because, well, that was just, that was a zoo, that was bonkers. I don't think that's the country is not going to reopen as quickly as it shut down. So I threw out May and April. But there's two big things that I want you to take away. The first is that, believe it or not, we grew dairy demand during the pandemic. Now, how did we grow dairy demand in the pandemic? If you look over at that government purchasing, the government buying more than eclipsed our total growth. In other words, without the government, we would have been very negative. And if you look at the magnitudes of that, is without the government, butter consumption would have been very, very negative during the pandemic. You'll also notice, surprisingly, that our exports in the pandemic were not significantly affected. I think that as we unwind from the pandemic, the opposite will happen. As the globe reopens, we have all this pent-up demand in export markets. So that too, I think, will show further growth. So that's kind of the setup as we undergo out of it. We'll see retail sales slow. We'll see food service sales pick up in a major way. And then the big wild card is the timing and magnitude of government purchases. Taken together, I think you end up with a conclusion, though, is that as we get to the second half of the year with demand growing at a healthy pace, we won't need the government to be involved in markets. And as a consequence, things aren't going to be so rough. Now you contrast that with the first half of the year, which is setting up from a fundamental point of view without the government to be very kind of weak. And you can see how that aligns with that bigger picture view that we started off with, that 2021 is setting up to be a mixed bag. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is feed costs. And the way that I've graphed them here is revenue over feed costs. I've taken futures prices, calculated an all milk price, and then I've taken corn and soybean prices and calculated a feed cost. And I want to point out that 2021 is looking like the lowest margins, basically comparable to 2018. And the reason why is feed costs on a per hundredweight basis are something like $2 a hundredweight higher. So I'll use anecdotes from customers that I work with. There's some super large dairies that I work with who are in extremely low cost areas of the country, whose break-even cost of milk last year was something like $14.50. This year, their break-even cost of milk is $16.50. Now these are commodity, this isn't fluid milk areas, commodity areas. But you can take that same thing where you are. If your break-even was 18 last year, or your neighbor's break-even was 18 last year, if you have to buy a lot of feed, your break-even this year is something closer to $20. So if you look at the futures curve today, there's no $20 milk up there. There's no $18 milk up there. And so 2021 is setting up at the moment to have much weaker margins. Now, they're not catastrophic margins. We're not talking 2009 margins. We're not talking 2012 margins, but we're talking weaker margins. Now, this contrasts with milk production. Milk production was up 3.1% in December. It was up 3.4% in November. And you can kind of see how that can happen when we had this big increase in that margin, especially if you throw in the government payments that triggered this growth. So how long can this growth last? I think by the time we get to June and July, we're really going to see, maybe a little bit later, July, August, the margin pressure slow that milk growth. So that's in summary what we're talking about this year in terms of prices. It's a mixed bag. I think we're going to have a substantial improvement in class 4 prices. I think we're going to have a substantial weakness in class 3 prices. You take it together, and we're talking about a year that is not a year of extremes. So with that, I'll send it back to you, Zach.
Thank you, Matt. I really appreciate that information. That was great. Nothing has come over the chat box. But again, anyone that has a question, please chat it, or if you want to unmute yourself and ask the question directly of Matt, that's fine. Maybe I'll ask, let's see, I do have one question here in reference to the 3-year price cycle on farm dairy investment. Due to negative PPDs, we saw wide disparity in producer pay prices. Do you see on-farm investment in 2021 affected on a regional basis?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess I'd like to talk about at least my anecdotal evidence related to that. I think a great example, or maybe the standout example of those disparities is the state of California. In California, you have members that ship to milk powder plants out there, and milk powder plants pay a milk price that is something close to class 4. That's what they're capable of paying. And then you also have, particularly more in the northern part of the dairying regions, you have these cheese plants. And of course, the cheese plant is capable of paying class 3. The way the California federal order works is that there isn't a lot of class 1 dollars in it. And so what happens is that if class 3 is higher than class 4, all the class 3 guys hop out. And then what happens is the order pool ends up looking like it's class 4. And if on the flip side, class 4 is higher than class 3, then all the class 4 guys will hop out and then the pool will all of a sudden look very class 3. What happened in the crux of, or the peak of class 3 prices this year was that guys who were selling milk to these cheese plants were literally getting paid double what guys were that selling milk to these class 4 plants. And so as a consequence of that, that's the disparity that you're talking about. Now that's a pretty extreme example, but then you can also think about the cheese producing regions, places like Idaho or the Midwest, Northwest Texas. All these places were very heavily class 3 focused, and they had the highest milk prices, in some cases the highest farm level margins ever, and at the very least comparable to 2014. And then you compare that to other guys who were in more heavily class 4 areas, and once you threw in the government intervention, they'll tell you that they came close to about breaking even. So yeah, absolutely. What happens when you get such extreme disparities like that is that the areas that made or netted, let's say they netted $4 or $5 a hundredweight last year, they're absolutely growing. You can look at the latest milk production data and you can see substantial growth in the Midwest as an example. Areas of the country that didn't benefit from that, or were only partially benefited from that, I think I would put, depending exactly on your situation, but Pennsylvania would be in that mix. Obviously it doesn't have the same extreme impact. So we're definitely seeing it regionally. That said, now that class 3 prices have calmed down, and now that class 4 prices have also not picked up, given where feed costs are, anyone who hasn't pre-bought feed, or most everyone that hasn't pre-bought feed, is now in a negative margin situation. So while we have all this growth currently, and probably more growth to come as we get into February and March, we're also, we're kind of at I guess we might call it in the middle part of that growth and production, because as you get into the later parts of the summer, those negative margins will bite. So that's absolutely the cause of it. Something else that I guess I want to point out, and this is something that's been of particular frustration to me, is that these are all kind of American dynamics. Cheese prices did not spike in New Zealand, and they did not spike in Europe. This was an American situation. And also in Europe, the dairy product prices didn't really plunge because the way that their consumer habits are is that they basically eat about as much dairy as when they're in home as they go out to eat. And that's obviously different from here in the US, where we eat a lot more dairy when we go out to eat than when we are in home. And so there's a natural kind of tendency to think, well, if this is what happened in the US, it must have happened everywhere. And that really isn't the case. And that's also one of the reasons why the US milk production is currently growing, at above 3%. But New Zealand, Europe, Australia, their milk production growth rates are subdued. And that's one of the reasons why we're not talking about extreme price negativity.
Zach, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Matt, the numbers that you use to calculate the total government numbers, did that include the PPP numbers that farms may have applied for and received?
Yeah, I threw in the PPP money. I was trying to come up with an estimate of kind of the total government influence on markets, so to speak. So I did include that PPP money. Now that PPP, PPP money is not an exact science. I assumed $1.60 a hundredweight for 2 months, April and March, and those are the numbers that I use, and they're just based off of kind of my short straw poll of a handful of contacts and how much PPP money they received.
While you mentioned sort of international stuff here in the question before last, November export numbers were released earlier this month, or reported earlier this month, and although it was for the first time in 14 months, November exports were down year over year, but still with the total of November added to the rest of 2020, we're already ahead of the 2018 record volume set. Do you what do you see happening in December, and do you think going into 2021, what do you think the export market looks like with our surplus milk and low milk prices? Do you see exports continuing to be pretty good going into through December and into this year?
Yeah, so there's actually, I think that's a great question, because it'll give me a chance to kind of talk about some very short-term dynamics at play. In some cases, some longer-term dynamics. Our slowdown in November was in large part a consequence of those record cheese prices. Our cheese exports plunged in November. At the same time, there's other products that are doing very, very well. Take, for example, our exports of dry whey. We are moving a lot of whey to China, and we're basically, China has caused a shortage or a major tightening worldwide in terms of whey products. And you think, well, what does that matter to me? Well, a 1 penny change in the dry whey price is about a 6 cents change in the class 3 milk price. So when we're talking about at the moment, whey prices that are up 20 cents, that adds almost $1.20 to your milk check. So, and the thing about the whey market is it trends really hard. It doesn't move like cheese moves. It trends really hard. And so that's a big bonus, an important bonus in your milk check. Dry whey is doing exceptional. Milk powder is doing decent because of the lack of major growth elsewhere. People are coming to the US. But at this very second, this moment in time, exporters are having problems in the West. And perhaps you've seen this, seen articles on this. I guess I just want to give you a report from the field, so to speak, is that because of basically a surge in imports from Asia, we have overwhelmed, and also I think in part because of the coronavirus effects on labor, we've overwhelmed our ports in the West. And so exporters are having a hard time getting milk powder and whey products and so forth onto boats. And that's the primary reason why at this very second, US milk powder prices are something like 15 cents below European levels, is just because of our struggling to get products on boats. Longer term though, I mean, we have the cheapest butter in the world by a long shot. We have the cheapest cheese in the world right now. We have the cheapest milk powder in the world. We may be the only place that has some amount of whey products. So 2021 is setting up to be an exceptional export year. I think probably setting up to be a record export year, especially as you figure in the unwinding of the pandemic and what that's going to do to global dairy demand.
Thanks, Matt. I've got one more question that came in on the chat box, but just remind everyone again, if you do have any questions, please send them to me and I'll ask Matt, or again, if you want to unmute yourself and ask, that is fine as well. So the question in the chat is, you said no extremes, but your last slide showed April or some month around there, a class 3 of $19. Do you think the average 2021 class 3, as on that slide, will happen?
Yeah, so in this forecast, I have the government amping up buying in March and April, and that's kind of my assumption. If we don't have that, we will have substantially lower prices. And so, as I kind of indicated in the first half, fundamentals at the moment are very weak. Guys are sending me milk checks with $6 deductions for over base milk, $10.50 per hundredweight deductions for over base milk, spot milk prices that are, $8 below class in the Midwest, dumping that's going on in the West, just a ramping up of cheese manufacturing on Glanbia, yada, 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 price negative stuff. And so at this very, very second, fundamentals are going head to head against the government. If there was no government purchasing, we would be having very, very low prices here in the first half of the year. So, do I think it'll happen? Yeah, this is my best guess on what I think the government's going to do. But my best guess on what the government is going to do isn't necessarily better than your best guess on what you think the government's going to do. It's not really in my hands. It's very much in the government's hands, so to speak, at this moment.
I had another question come in on the chat that I think is a really good question for you to answer. Why was butter not positively affected in price as cheese was?
So there's kind of two parts to that. One is that in the food boxes, USDA mandates that there has to be cheese in each box. So in this latest announcement, USDA has announced by the end, between the 26th of January and the end of February, they're going to buy 11 million boxes of food. In each box, there has to be cheese. So if there's 1 pound of cheese in each box, that's 11 million pounds of cheese. If there's 2 pounds of cheese in each box, there's 22 million pounds of cheese. In total, though, there has to be 5 or 6 pounds of dairy products and then a gallon of milk. The box says that you can also include, so you have to include cheese, but then you can also include butter or cultured dairy products. And so a lot of these boxes are ending up with sour cream and yogurt and no butter. And because there's no mandate to put butter in the box, you're not moving an equal amount of cheese and butter through the box. And that's the reason why we had cheese prices go to record levels and butter prices not do that. So, that also leads to the next follow-on question, which is, well, because the government played a big role in influencing the cheese market this past year, well, what are they going to do to the butter guys? They're obviously, they need to make everyone whole. They can't just favor part of the industry. And that is currently a lobbying effort that is going on, and particularly those Western butter producers have been very heavy in this, in trying to get a bone thrown towards the butter industry. I don't know if we will or won't. I think the dairy donation program could have something for it, but that's back to that precarious government isn't clear about what they're going to do, and they're willing to drop billions. Like that's where we're at. And if they fumble and they pick one product, cheese over another, butter, well, that's how we got the crazy price movement that we got this past year.
So again, if there's any other questions, please feel free to unmute yourself or send them to me in the chat. I had a question on the tip of my tongue and then I forgot it. So
there is one thing that I wanted to say that I didn't say, that I guess to not blame the government for everything. One thing that is true is that when we go out to eat, we eat a lot more butter than when we are in home. And so you can think about, well, maybe you go out to eat and you have a cream-based soup, or you go and I've never eaten as much bread as when I'm at an Italian restaurant. I've never eaten as much butter in a sitting as when I'm at an Italian restaurant. So the government, ignoring the government's role, food service, the lack of bringing people in home did hit butter demand harder than it hit cheese demand. And so maybe if you put it differently, it's the 1-2 punch of kind of the consumption habits in the pandemic and also the government.
All right. Well, one question I was going to ask, I sort of thought about it, but PPDs were brought up in the first question, and a lot of that, I know there's several things that went into play last year to make PPDs as negative as they were, but one of the main contributors was the fluid one, or the class 1 milk price determination.
Yeah.
Of course, I mean, that change was made back in May of 2019, and I think it was the best and made in the bet with the best intentions, and it benefited dairy farmers from May of 2019 till March or April of 2020. But then, of course, when class 3 and class 4 got so far apart, that contributed to depooling and the negative PPDs because of that, the disparity between the class 3 and class 4. And I know there's efforts now going on by the same organizations that made the change to try to change that. Do you have any opinion on maybe what an answer for that class 1 price determination is? Do you have an opinion on in an ideal world what you think that that class 1 price might look like?
Sure. I'm going to try and give as many perspectives as I have. And I do have an opinion. I will share my opinion, but my opinion is not industry opinion. It's just Matt's opinion. If we had had the higher of in place, what would have happened is that class 1 price would have kept up and would have been close to $25 at the peak. The federal orders would have been higher than either, for the most part, higher than either the class 3 or class 4 prices. And we wouldn't have had the depool. I think that's just a straight up fact. The choice of making it an average, well, you can see it here, and this is why I brought up the chart. As you can see, the average obviously brought down, was lower, caused class 1 to be lower than the class 3 price. And that's why we did have the depool. The whole reason for creating the average plus 74 cents was in order to make it easier to hedge class 1 milk. Otherwise, under the previous formula, the higher of is that if you pick the wrong higher of, well, then you didn't have a hedge at all. In fact, the data suggests, and I've done modeling with Marin Bozic on this, and Jordan Clark, who's now at Albertson Safeway, but was a grad student at the time. And it shows that if you picked the higher of and tried to hedge class 1 using that, it was about as volatile as just not hedging it at all. That's how bad the hedge error was under the previous formula. So they changed the formula to make it easier to manage risk. And in process, or as an effect of that, they materially weakened the whole federal order system. So what do I think is the right answer? I think the right answer is to go back to the higher of, and then have the industry or the government provide funding to the CME to launch a class 1 milk futures contract. That would get us back to having integrity of the pool, and I think would give a more liquid hedge tool. Now, the reason why you have to give money to the CME is because, at least initially, there may not be any money from the CME's perspective to be made in the class 1 market, something that would have to develop over a long period of time. But if you could get them on board with the class 1 futures contract, then boom, you could switch back. And I think that would be a palatable solution. At the moment, to go to the CME and say, hey, CME, can you invest money and develop this product at your own cost? They're not interested, at least that's what I'm told.
All right, thanks. I have one more question come in, and I think this is sort of a follow-up to what I just asked you, but maybe in a more broader sense, and that is, in your opinion, is there a better way to price milk? So I'm assuming the question is pertaining to the entire classified system of pricing milk.
Yeah, I wrote an article several years ago for Progressive Dairymen about, well, whose system is best? Should we be copying the New Zealand system? Should we be copying the Australian system? Should we be trying to copy what they have in Europe? And much to, I think, everyone's disappointment, is there is no such thing as a silver bullet. And you can go and look at other systems. What happened in Australia is they largely deregulated. And then only several years ago, Murray Goulburn, the largest co-op, went bust. And when they went bust, they took down 1/10 of their industry with them. You can kind of look at the New Zealand system, which is basically a system for a monopoly type organization, and their system basically hamstrings them in their inability to cheaply make cheese. So they can make, if their system works for milk powder, and butter and AMF, but it doesn't work with beans for butter. And in Europe, there isn't these block level regulations, and so every producer is very dependent on their processor. Dairy has a few very challenging aspects. First off, in most places, there is not a competitive market for milk. There's one processor buying from a large group of farmers. So there's this natural just inequity where one organization has more power than the other. Additionally, you can't really transport milk very far, and it's perishable. And then thirdly, and this makes it very tricky, is that it's not the same, because someone's milk has 4% fat in it and another guy's milk has 3.5% fat. And so, there's been a lot of talk of trying to look at, say, well, maybe we need to copy what the guys in electricity do. They have local monopolies. There's only one electricity plant in town, and they're around, and there's a perishability. But the thing about electricity is it's electricity. It's homogeneous. It's the same. And so that's why no one has seemed to crack the code on the silver bullet system. And you will deal with trade-offs pretty well, no matter what system that you have. So that's a complicated system, a complicated way, I guess, or a more well-rounded way of saying every system has its problems. And so you're, if you have a system that works, you might just say, well, then, we'll deal with the problems that it also produces, because there's no such thing as a problem-free system.
We had a couple more, one person sent in a couple questions, and these will be, we're getting close to 1 o'clock, so these will be our last questions. But the first part, I'll go ahead and read the full chat, and then you can answer it, Matt, as you see fit. But the first part of the question is, what was the percentage of retail sales prior to COVID versus today? And then the second question is, do you think food service sales will return to levels pre-COVID?
Yeah, so in the case of both cheese and butter, we consumed approximately before COVID, somewhere close to 45% of our cheese and butter through retail channels. Post-COVID, I don't know what that number is in my head, but we know that retail sales for cheese, I think they're up something like 11%. So that brings us close to I guess 50. And for butter retail sales, I don't know it off the top of my head. I think they're up something closer to 16, 18%. And food service and other channels have fallen the remainder. So I guess instead of putting math to it, the way that I describe it is that pre-COVID, we ate more cheese and butter when we went out to eat than in home. And as I think about returning back to life like it was before, I think that will be true. And there's been a lot of speculation, and no one really knows for sure, but there's been a lot of speculation on this idea of pent-up demand, that as we get the vaccine and things normalize, that food service sales aren't going to just return to normal levels, but that for a short period of time, the first several, maybe the third quarter into the fourth quarter, you're just going to have extraordinary food service sales. And this idea of pent-up demand, we've certainly seen it in dairy on the supply side, where we saw pent-up supply, where Europe couldn't grow for years. And then as soon as they could grow, then boom, they flooded the market with milk. So I think there is a reasonable basis to believe that we will have pent-up demand in food service, which will be good for cheese and butter. And then that'll taper out as I think we get into the fourth quarter and start emerging into a post-COVID land. At least the hopes of that, right? We all hope that there isn't another strain that we don't have a vaccine for. And my guess on this is as good as yours. So I don't want to pretend like we know for sure that we can defeat this thing, but at least from my perspective, looks like it's promising.
Well, thank you again, Matt. That's all the time we have today. Thank you for your presentation and your answers to all these questions. We really appreciate it. I thought it was an excellent presentation, and I liked your answers as well. thank you everyone that participated in today's webinar. I think this may have been our record for the number of people to attend the webinar live. So thank you for joining us today. And if you do have any questions, you can get them to me and I can get them to Matt, or contact me and I can get you Matt's contact information. And you can ask him directly. Either way, I'm sure is fine with him. Also, a lot of people joined late, so I was recording this webinar, and the link will be made available on our webpage, centerfordairyexcellence.org/protecting your profits. So that will be available later on today on our webpage, and I'll also be emailing it out to my email list. So if you're not on my email list, I was also live streaming on Facebook and YouTube, so you can go to that now and watch what you missed if you please, and also the January Protecting Your Profits webpage or podcast is uploaded on the podcast page now. So, or if you've subscribed to it on Spotify, Amazon Music, or Apple Podcasts, you should be getting a notification on that soon. So it's available. And with that, again, thank you, Matt, and all the participants. There was another question to come in, but Matt, I'll email that to you and get the answer to that question to the individual that sent it. And again, thank you, and I appreciate everybody's participation, and I will look forward to next. A regularly scheduled a webinar next February. I don't remember the date off the top of my head. February 24th will be the next Protecting Your Profits webinar, again at noon. And with that, thank you, and look forward to talking with you next month.